So one thing that came out of the Tuskegee experiment and the exposure that the news reports brought to this study is the Belmont report, right? So in the Belmont report, a group of scientists from all fields met together and came up with some guidelines to guide future research in all fields. Now, I'll go over some specifics for psychology in a future video, but these are some general guidelines that guide how we should do research with humans. So in the principle of beneficence, it specifically focuses on keeping the health of our participants in mind. Now, there are several parts of the study design process and research process, I should say, where we can keep this in mind. But you can keep this in mind in two main parts. In designing your study, you could take into account the well-being of your participant, potential risks, right? There's an IRB review in place now that reviews each study at every university. And as a researcher, you can take that into account too, right? You can take into account, will my participant be harmed by me asking them about their parents? Well, you can weigh the risks. Well, maybe it's fine to ask, but I could imagine some participants having traumatic experiences with their parents. It might be tricky to ask them about that. Okay, so you might design a study with that in mind. And then the second part of the study, of the research process where you could keep this and take this into account, is when you're actually running participants. When you're actually running participants, if you notice, you ask this question about the participants' parents, they start getting teary-eyed, you keep going deeper and deeper, and they start showing signs of distress, you stop the study immediately, right? Even when they start getting teary-eyed, you check. Like, are you okay? Do you want to continue? But you need to design a protocol that takes that into account. If there's these kind of reactions, you need to end the study. Now, it might be tricky in some situations, because in some situations, especially before you start collecting data, well, how do you measure risk? Well, it might be difficult to measure risk. You might have to do it in a more qualitative way, where instead of trying to quantify it, you think about, well, what are the potential situations, risks, outcomes of me asking this question, of me having participants participate in this kind of behavior? What might happen in that situation, right? So you really need to take the time to reflect on that and think about how might participating in what might seem to me like a neutral question, what might elicit some negative experiences for some participants. And I'm using questions because I'm thinking of surveys, of interviews, but it might not be that kind of study. So you have to think of that for your particular study. Ideally, you and your team are reflecting on this, and you'll get feedback from the review board at each university has regarding whether it's ethical or not, right? But you need to do this on your own as well. Now, the principle of justice specifically focuses on, well, who's represented in the study, right? Who are the participants, and who benefits? So think about the Tuskegee study, right? The syphilis study. In this study, it was primarily rural black farmers, poor farmers, that were recruited to participate in this study. And who benefited? Well, we all did, right? The Guatemalan study, they purposely infected people. So right away, that's an ethical issue. But both studies, right? But that's egregious, right? They infected people, and then who benefited from that understanding of how syphilis worked? Well, the US did, right? So you're infecting people who have little control over their lives, because these were prisoners in Guatemala and in another country. And we're all benefiting from this understanding. And then there's all these other ethical issues that happen in both studies, but this principle of justice specifically focuses on that. Who's being recruited for the study, and who benefits from the study? Are you taking advantage of their situation? Being a prisoner, you have little choice over your life, being poor and a rural farmer from a marginalized background, it's going to be hard to say no to free healthcare, especially if you don't know what you have, right? They didn't know they had syphilis, right? So you can take advantage of that situation. So in this principle of justice, we're taking that into account. Who are we recruiting and who's benefiting? Okay, so we've gone over two principles, right? The principle of beneficence, principle of justice. Now we have the principle of respect for persons, right? Meaning that individuals, well, should be respected as a human being and an autonomous human being. This primarily includes that the individual should decide to participate in the study on their own, meaning they should consent to participate, but then also, what does consent mean, right? They should know what they're consenting to. The consent form should be written in such a way that any individual or the individuals you're recruiting will understand what they're agreeing to participate. They understand the risks, they understand what they're being asked to do. If there's any deception, the deception can't be on the risks in the study, right? If they're going to be pricked by a needle, asked to participate in an interview, they should know they're doing those things. So risks you can't deceive about. If you're working with a population that can't read, you have to take into account, well, how do you get consent in that situation? If you're recruiting participants who speak Farsi only, who speak Spanish only, who speak Tagalog only, you have to provide the consent form in their language so they can know what they're agreeing to, or have somebody that can communicate the information to them, right? Because you also have verbal consent. So the participant needs to know what they're participating in, and they have to agree to it. And part of that includes knowing what they're agreeing to. Now, I mentioned it earlier, right? But you cannot mislead them about the potential risks. You can have some deception, right? But they should know so in my favorite study, you might be ingesting some caffeine. Now, you can mislead them about whether they're actually receiving the caffeine or not, but you can't mislead them to think they're not getting caffeine. You can't say, oh, you're just gonna be drinking some decaf coffee, and actually some of them get the caffeinated coffee. No, you can't do that. They need to know what the potential risks, especially when in any situation, they need to know about the risks. It's not and especially in any situation, they need to know about the risks regardless of whether you're using deception or not. And that might include discomfort. You might be asked to answer questions about your relationship with your parents, and that may make you, that might cause some discomfort for you. You cannot coerce them to participate or unduly influence them to participate. So coerce, you're forcing them. You're saying you have no choice, you must participate in the study. And unduly influence, it might vary what that means. Maybe you have more power over them. Maybe it's hard for them to say no, like in the Tuskegee experiment, where they felt they were receiving all these benefits, including healthcare, why would they turn that down? If you're recruiting participants from a marginalized background, or let's say a lower income background, and you're saying, hey, if you participate in this very uncomfortable study, very intrusive, you're participating for a year, and I'm watching you in your home, and I'm asking you to take all these blood tests. Well, I'll give you $1,000 now, right? Would that be unduly influencing them? Would that be ethical to say to a person in a vulnerable situation, economically vulnerable, will you participate in the study if I give you this much money, right? That's actually something that is taken into account when we have our studies reviewed by the review board at the university level here at CSUN. How much money are you offering to students? What are they being asked to participate in, right? So you need to make sure you're not coercing them or unduly influencing them, right? They should have the option to say no, and it should be a real option to say no. So also within respect for persons, so within that principle, we have special protected groups. This includes children, prisoners and individuals with developmental problems or learning issues. So, meaning individuals who would not understand what they're consenting to, or they have very little choice in consenting, right? It feels like they're being forced. So, for example, starting off with prisoners, the Guatemalan study, the prisoners had very little option in participating in the study. They had no choice, right? Okay, there's that part to it, right? Where that's actually more about coercion. But think about prisoners where they're being offered $20 to participate in a very intrusive study, a medical study that's testing a new drug. As a prisoner, $20 could go a long way in terms of what you can purchase, right? So you might feel influenced and have very little choice and maybe even feel pressured by whoever's overseeing you in the jail to participate. So do you really have a choice in that situation? Because of that, this is a special protected group. There has to be somebody on the review committee, so the internal review board, who reviews your study, if you're going to work with prisoners, that advocates for the prisoners, right? So there has to be somebody on that team advocating for the prisoner, making sure you're taking into account their choice to opting in, to consenting, and what that study is actually doing to that person once they're in the study. There are studies with newborns that are literally hours after birth. They've studied to see how they react to hearing their mom's voice, how they react to hearing other people's voice, how they react to different stimuli, right? Can a newborn, can even a 5-year-old understand what they're agreeing to, right? The newborn, they can't even talk yet. The 5-year-old, do they understand what they're being asked? Hey, if you participate in the study, I'll give you this. And it kind of sounds creepy in a way, right? Right? No, they can't. So we have special protections for them as well. They're considered a special protected group in the situation. So in this situation with children, the parents or the guardians need to give consent. And if the child's old enough to give verbal assent, then we ask for the child for assent as well, meaning they're agreeing to participate in the study. But ultimately, the parent has a final say regarding whether that child participates in the study or not. And of course, there's this thorough review about whether it's safe for the child or not. So anytime you're working with one of these groups, your study is going to go through an extra thorough review by the IRB on campus. Now, I review this later on, but just to let you know now, the internal review board is a committee on campus that reviews every study, right? So if you're working with one of these groups, children, inmates, or individuals who might not cognitively understand what they're agreeing to, they're going to take some extra time to review your study for ethics and potential harms to the participants. And it makes sense, right? These are children, these are individuals who have very little say of what they're participating in, and it might be difficult to say no. Okay, so just a recap, we had the principle of beneficence, keeping the participants' health in mind and their well-being in mind. We had the principle of justice, who's being recruited and who's benefiting from the study. And we had the principle of respect for persons, the fact that we need to make sure that the participants know what they're consenting to participate in, right? Do they know what you're asking them to do in the study? Do they know what they've agreed to or what you're asking them to agree to? If you have any questions, let me know.